U.S. Navy Kamikaze Submarines Part 1, The Depths of Despair, Pacific Ocean, 1945. The air on the island of Guam was thick and salty, smelling of diesel fuel, paint, and fear. The war with Japan, which had begun with the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, was approaching its bloody climax. Every day brought reports of fierce Japanese resistance on the approaches to their homeland, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. Saping these names became synonymous with inhuman tenacity and monstrous losses on both sides. American command, looking to the near future, envisioned not victory, but the bloodbath of Operation Downfall, the landing on the Japanese home islands themselves. The projected losses numbered in the millions. It was in this atmosphere of despair that one of the U.S. Navy's darkest and most secret projects was born. In an abandoned hangar, carefully guarded by the Marines, work unlike any other was taking place. Here, far from prying eyes, a last resort weapon was being born. The project was codenamed Project Stingray. The mastermind and chief designer was Commander Victor Reynolds, a naval architect with a brilliant mind and a haggard face. Before the war, he designed racing yachts, his dream being to create the fastest and most elegant vessels in the world. The war had changed everything. Now his genius was directed toward creating a killing machine, the most efficient and most inhumane he could imagine. He stood before his creation, a midget submarine of the SEE Submarine Emergency Explorer class. It was unlike the fearsome Ghetto or Belial class that dominated the ocean. It was a steel, cigar-shaped hull just over 10 meters long, so cramped that only 1 or 2 people could fit inside. The boat had no torpedo tubes. Its main armament was its own bow compartment, packed with 2 tons of powerful explosives. The Skate's mission was simple and terrifying, like the Japanese kamikazes. Sneak into a heavily guarded harbor, steer itself into the side of an enemy battleship or aircraft carrier, and blow itself up. The crew would face certain death. This isn't a weapon fit, Rear Admiral Hayes, who oversaw the project, once told him. His face was stony. It's an act of desperation. But desperation is all we have left if we want to avoid millions of casualties during the landing. Reynolds nodded, clutching the drawing. He understood the logic. One such boat, worth pennies compared to a destroyer or cruiser, could destroy a flagship at the cost of just 2 lives. This was the monstrous arithmetic of war. The main challenge wasn't the boat itself, but finding a crew who would agree to certain death. A special psychological profile was created for this purpose. They sought volunteers without families, idealists fanatically devoted to duty, or, conversely, those so hardened by the war that they sought redemption or simply a quick end. They were called Special Risk Volunteers. One of the first was Lieutenant Jackie Thornton, a tall, blue-eyed man from Maine, a former cutterman. His destroyer was sunk by a kamikaze off Okinawa. He miraculously survived, spending 16 hours in waters filled with debris and sharks. Surrounded by the screams of his dying comrades, he returned from the war a different man, silent, distant, with eyes that had lost their light. For him, the Stingray wasn't a death sentence, but a chance to end the nightmare once and for all, turning it against those who started it. The second volunteer was a completely different type, Lieutenant Kenji Ken Yamato, a second-generation Japanese-American Nisei. His family was in an internment camp in Arizona. He went to the front to prove his loyalty to America. He was quiet, thoughtful, and a brilliant engineer. For Ken, the Stingray mission wasn't suicide, but the ultimate sacrifice, meant to wash away the shame from his family and prove he was a true American. Their training was hellish. They were placed in a prototype submarine. The hatches were battened down and left in a stuffy, cramped steel tube for 24 hours, simulating a long patrol. They learned to navigate a submarine almost blindly, using only passive sonar and a pencil-sized periscope. They practiced infiltrating mock harbors entangled in anti-submarine nets and filled with hydrophones. They were taught to be a shadow, a silent ghost, to dissolve into the water and emerge only at the moment of the final, fatal thrust. One evening, Reynolds found Thornton and Yamato at the pier. They sat, smoking and silently watching the setting sun. "Are you sure of your choice?" Reynolds asked quietly. Thornton, without looking at him, shook his head. "Someone has to do it, Commander. Better us than thousands of guys on landing craft." Kenji simply nodded, his face calm and determined. Reynolds turned away. He had created the weapon, but these two were to be his mind, his heart, and his soul. He looked at his boats, lined up in the hangar, and saw not a triumph of engineering, but 36 steel coffins, ready to be launched. He had created the American Kamikaze, and this fact burned inside him like a red-hot iron. War erased the boundaries not only between life and death, but also between the concepts of hero and suicide bomber. Part 2. Steel-fenced hangar on Guam became a purgatory. 3 midget submarines, designated X-1, X-2, and X-3, sat on the slipways like steel torpedoes aimed at an invisible enemy. Their development was carried out in a frantic rush. War didn't wait. Every day brought news of fierce battles, and the specter of Operation Downfall grew ever more real. The crews, Jack Thornton and Kenji Yamato on the X-1, and other volunteers like them on the X-2 and X-3, spent days and nights melding with their machines. They had to know every screw, every contact, every emergency valve. There was no room for error inside the sub. The space was organized with frightening efficiency, a pilot seat with an engine behind it, a control panel with a dozen switches and pressure gauges, a tiny periscope, and a steering wheel that looked more like a toy. The smell was a cocktail of ozone, machine oil, and human sweat. The Skate's main tactical advantage was its slowness and small size. It couldn't outrun a destroyer, but it could sneak up on one unnoticed. Like a shark in shallow water, the boat was virtually silent at low speeds. Its hull, coated with a special rubber compound, absorbed sonar sound. The crew's task was simple: become part of the ocean, dissolve into it, wait patiently, and strike at the right moment. The training entered its final stage night exercises in the open ocean. The X-1, carrying Thornton and Yamato, was towed dozens of miles from shore and then released to sail freely. Their mission was to approach the target undetected and old. Decommissioned transport guarded by 2 destroyers. That night, the ocean was rough. Underwater currents swept the Skate's lightweight hull like a sliver of wood. Inside, it was stuffy, and condensation dripped from the ceiling, forming puddles on the floor. Thornton, sitting at the helm, peered into the green screen of the passive sonar. Yamato, acting as navigator, checked the charts and whispered commands: propeller noise, bearing 075. Thornton whispered. 2 sources, destroyers, descending to 30 feet. Steady speed, Kenji replied. They became a shadow. The submarine moved slowly, almost on the verge of collapse. The destroyer's sonars, sending out their pings into the darkness, glided over their hulls. Oblivious, they were a drop in the ocean, a grain of sand. An hour later, a large silhouette appeared on the sonar transport. Target ahead. Range 5 cables, Yamato reported, his voice even, as if they were on a peacetime exercise. Preparing for attack, Thornton said, setting the submarine on a combat course. And then the unexpected happened. A deafening screeching sound echoed across the hull. The submarine lurched sideways. Yamato hit his head on the control panel. Damn it, anti-submarine net. Thornton cursed, desperately cranking the wheel. They snagged an unmarked net. The surface beacons must have immediately flared, alerting the guards. They were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. Reverse. Full speed, Yamato commanded, pressing a bloody handkerchief to his temple. The Skate shuddered, trying to free itself from the steel grip of the net. The destroyer's sonars immediately detected the source of the noise. Sharp, insistent pings pounded the hull like hammers. A few minutes later, the increasing roar of the propellers could be heard. The destroyer was bearing down on them. At that moment, Thornton and Yamato experienced what they would truly experience in a Japanese harbor: the chilling terror of being trapped, death approaching with a deafening roar. They stared at each other in the dim light of the emergency lights. This was no training scenario. This was a rehearsal for death. Thornton did the only thing he could. He gave the order to blow the ballast and go full speed ahead. The steel Skate, its engine roaring, surged forward, tearing through the net. A heart-rending screech echoed. The boat broke free, but one of its propellers was damaged. They surfaced 100 meters from the destroyer, which blinded them with its searchlights. The exercise had failed. They had been destroyed, but in that moment, standing on the deck under the mocking gazes of the destroyer's sailors, Thornton and Yamato realized something important. They weren't afraid of death. In the moment of crisis, their minds worked like clockwork. There was fear, but it was suppressed by training and the monstrous purpose that drove them. They were ready to die, asterisk returning to base. They silently began helping the mechanics repair the damaged propeller. Commander Reynolds watched them from afar. He saw their calm, focused faces. They had already crossed some inner threshold. They were no longer just soldiers. They were weapons, living, sentient, doomed weapons, and the sight was simultaneously majestic and terrifying. The plan was approved. The first raid by 3C submarines on Japan's main naval base at Kure was scheduled for November 1, 1945. They were to be transported 50 miles offshore aboard carrier submarines. Then came their journey, a one-way trip. The goal, as many Imperial Navy warships as possible in the inner roads. They had spent the last week studying aerial photographs of the harbor, current patterns, patrol schedules. They knew Kure better than their hometowns. They were preparing for their final journey, for their final dive. Part 3, The Shadow That Never Rose, August 1945. The base on Guam was in a state of feverish anticipation. 3C boats had been finalized, inspected, and declared combat-ready. Their hulls were painted a matte dark gray, making them nearly invisible in the night water. Explosives were loaded into the forward compartments. The crews spent their final days in isolation, receiving final instructions and writing farewell letters. Lieutenant Jack Thornton wrote only one letter to his younger brother, who was still in school. He wrote about duty, about honor, about the importance of finishing what he started. He didn't write about fear. He didn't write about dreaming of the faces of his comrades from the sinking destroyer. He signed the letter and gave it to Commander Reynolds. Lieutenant Kenji Yamato wrote 2 letters. The first was to his parents at the internment camp. He asked for their forgiveness for all their worries and their pride in their son. The second, short and pithy, was addressed to the U.S. government. In it, he demanded justice for all Nisei and the release of his family once the war was over. His sacrifice was to be not only an act of patriotism, but also atonement for his entire community. Commander Reynolds accepted these letters with a stony face. Each one weighed like a lead weight. He was not only an engineer, but also a gravidigger. He knew he would likely never send these letters because the recipients would perish in the invasion. This mission was supposed to prevent. It was a vicious cycle of sacrifice. The X-date was approaching. The carrier submarines, modified to carry the escape missiles, had already put to sea and taken up positions. The crews received their final briefing. They were shown enlarged photographs of the battleships Yamato and Nagato, moored in Kure. These giants had become symbols of Japanese might. Destroying one of them was tantamount to sinking an entire fleet. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the base was quiet as if it were a pre-battle battle. The departure was scheduled for the evening. The submarines were to be loaded on transports and set course for Japan. Thornton and Yamato conducted a final inspection of the X-1. Their movements were precise, automatic. They were already mentally there, in the cold waters of the inland sea. And suddenly, horns blared throughout the island. Not alarms, but something else, something unfamiliar. Then, a frantic announcer's voice came from the loudspeakers mounted on the poles. At first, no one could understand the meaning. The words atomic bomb, Hiroshima, total annihilation rushed in a continuous stream, dawning their comprehension. At first, there was misunderstanding, then distrust. Then, when the official confirmation arrived, a wave of spontaneous, animalistic jubilation swept across the base. Soldiers and sailors fired into the air, hugged and shouted. The war was over. They wouldn't have to storm the Japanese shores. They would survive. But in the hangar, where the 3 skates were moored, a deathly silence reigned. Thornton, Yamato, and the other crew members stood next to their boats, silently looking at the jubilant crowd outside the gates. They felt no joy. They felt devastation. The readiness for death they had cultivated for months suddenly became unnecessary. Their great sacrifice, their final, desperate push, all of it suddenly became absurd. Commander Reynolds entered the hangar. His face was pale. He walked to the operational plan board and silently erased all the notes with chalk. Then he turned to them. Project Skate is canceled. His voice was hoarse and broken. Mission canceled. By order from above. No one said a word. Yamato slowly sank onto a toolbox and buried his face in his hands. Thornton rested his forehead on the cold hull of his boat. They had been saved, but this rescue felt like defeat. They had been robbed of the meaning they had chosen for themselves. They were heroes destined never to achieve a feat. They were the living dead, suddenly brought back to life, but without a purpose. A few days later, news came of Nagasaki, and then of Japan's surrender. The war was truly over. The sea boats had never conducted a single combat mission. They had been disarmed, their explosives removed and stored. 3 of them were later donated to museums, silent witnesses to what people were willing to do in their hour of greatest despair. Jack Thornton returned to Maine, but never found a place for himself in civilian life. He died young, said to be from the survivor's curse. Kenji Yamato secured his family's release and became a successful engineer, but he never discussed the Stingray project with anyone. Commander Reynolds remained mired in mixed emotions for the rest of his life. Relief that his creation hadn't claimed the lives of young men, but also a crushing sense of guilt for ever having conceived of such a thing. The Stingrays remain in history as the darkest and most unrealized chapter of World War II. They were a weapon born in the depths of despair, and a symbol of the terrible price the civilized world was willing to pay for victory, before finding another, even more terrifying, but less bloody path for its soldiers. They reminded us that the line between heroism and fanaticism, between duty and mortal despair, can sometimes be ghostly thin, like the steel hull of a midget submarine.